Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 28th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. What discusses tonight are David Green and Ron Zote. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky said that in the American media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Today is July 11th. On this day in 1980, a U.S.-trained army murdered an El Salvadorian poet, Jaime Suarez Camain, an anarchist. Suarez Camain wrote, "The streets of San Salvador will never disremember. They know how to count the dead. The streets of San Salvador will never disremember. One day they shall speak out as serene justice." That was the same U.S.-trained and CIA-directed army that murdered Archbishop Romero at Mass and the 6 Jesuit intellectuals and 2 witnesses at the University of Central America, in what Chomsky has called a U.S. war against the church in Latin America. Because the church spoke up for the people the U.S. was massacring across Central America, generating the conditions that now lead to the migration of children to the U.S., except from Nicaragua, which defended itself by revolution against U.S. crimes. And in a self-indulgent note, I'll mention that today, July 11th, is my 50th wedding anniversary. There's a ragtime song from before World War I, 50 years before that contains the lines, "Through a field of clover we'll ride up to Dover on our golden wedding day." So you're watching News from Neptune, the Up to Dover edition. And David Green will begin, not, I'm afraid, with fields of clover, but with killing fields for which we are responsible. David?
Well, first, before I get into the nasty stuff, many happy returns to you and your bride.
Thank you very much.
The events that precede this point in time and midday on July 11th, about a week or 10 days, depending on how you judge it, into the most recent Israeli assault on Gaza, which has its roots in the already several-week-old kidnappings and killings of 3 Israeli youth, and subsequent revenge killings on at least 1 Palestinian youth, but really many more. These events have kind of raced ahead of some of the issues that I had planned and actually sort of advertised to discuss on this program, having to do with the nature of the denial of the Holocaust and the way that may affect discourse about various issues in our local community and our obscure local listserv. And also another issue having to do with Noam Chomsky's relationship to the pro-Palestinian movement and his sort of cautionary criticisms of the BDS, of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement that came out a couple weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, before the escalation of violence in the Middle East. So I sort of wanted to deal with both of those things, but events have, and I will briefly, just to kind of set up a kind of narrative, sort of discursive narrative here, that I think will hold together in one way or the other in terms of being relevant to events on the ground as we speak. It was actually a little bit disturbing this morning to see Amy Goodman kind of offer two sides, to offer an opportunity to an Israeli propagandist to spout the usual propaganda regarding the fact that Israel makes phone calls to people before it drops bombs on their houses. I don't think it's really necessary. It should be necessary. It may be charitable and it may be fair-minded, but it shouldn't necessarily be necessary to air both sides on a left-wing talk show. Those sides are going to be heard on the mainstream media. It would probably be better to have various sides explaining from views that are sympathetic to the nature of Israeli or to Palestinian oppression to have their say. I think a probably more interesting interesting discussion, which I haven't watched yet, but is on the Real News with Max Blumenthal and Ali Abu Nima talking, both from sort of pro-Palestinian points of view. What I wanted to say about denialism as it pertains to our obscure local listserv and local character who pops up and so carries all the baggage, all the sort of conspiracy theorizing baggage about 9/11 truth and so forth that extends all the way into anti-Semitism and how those of us on the left who are accused of not responding forcefully enough to pointing out the relationship between Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, what all that is about. And what I had intended to say, and what I will say briefly in that context, is that what's occurred to me in trying to think about that issue is how denialism is construed in our political culture and in the manufacture of consent within our political culture. I've been reading some of Noam Chomsky's older writings in a couple of volumes called The Political Economy of Human Rights, which he wrote with Edward Herman in the late 70s, in the early 80s, and then Manufacture of Consent in the late 80s, which discuss mostly our participation and the media coverage of the wars in Southeast Asia that extended roughly from 1945 to 1975, and our country's roles in them. And when you think about denialism in that context, you're thinking not about something as transparent as denying the Holocaust or denying that the Germans could have killed as many Jews as they did at Auschwitz and so forth. Acknowledging the number of deaths that occurred in Southeast Asia during this period of time, but not acknowledging who was responsible for them. That's also a kind of denialism, and it seems like it's a much more relevant and pertinent form of, and a more insidious form of denialism than things coming from the conspiracy wing of the 9/11 truth movement, in which everyone perfectly well understands that Holocaust denial isn't exactly the fashion du jour, and that it really doesn't present any threat politically in terms of the manner in which anti-Semitism evolves and the manner in which it takes political root. It's much more important, I think, to attend to those things that are denials of authority figures, denials of our propaganda system, because those are the kind of denials that allow the kind of perpetuation of things that, as we see on the ground in Israel and Palestine and many other places right now. A good example of that happened to pop up in the last week or so in the New York Times, which I don't usually read lately, but my attention was brought to this article, and it's really quite fascinating. I think there's a man named Philip Zelikow who wrote an op-ed piece called quarantine the Middle East, which I think stands as a monument to liberal, quasi-liberal political propaganda as a form of denial, in which he innocently proclaims that we will just have to leave the Middle East to figure out its own problems and help whenever we can. But, these people, we've given everything we can to these people, and they're just going to have to figure it out. And if Iraq falls apart and Syria falls apart, and he also proposes quite boldly, whatever, at the end, that the Palestinians adopt the Israeli tactic of the late 1940s of developing a state in waiting, with the hopes that, as we all know, in Israel, they while they were developing their state in waiting, they were also terrorizing the British colonizers. And I mean, you can't make this stuff up as to how ridiculous this op-ed piece in the New York Times was, and how revealing it is of this much more consequential form of denialism.
Wasn't Zelikow a Clinton administration State Department functionary?
No, he was actually in the Bush administration in the State Department.
I think he was
2005 or 6. May have been involved in Clinton also. And what's so impressive about Zelikow, quote unquote, is that he is a, as you may know, Carl, a historian. He teaches at the University of Virginia. He is the sort of Arthur Schlesinger of the Bush administration or the Clinton administration, or of the sort of the current.
I'm not sure about the Clinton connection.
And right. So, but in any event, it's as Chomsky is always pointing out, we have a slight interruption here.
I'm sorry, not going to answer it.
Is that yours, Ron?
I think so.
Oh, okay. But anyway.
It's Mr. Zelikow from the State Department who wants a word.
Yeah. But anyway, so I just wanted to point those out in the context of emphasizing what kind of denialism is really relevant and important, and tells us about our propaganda system. It tells us about the people who have power, not about a few sort of nutcases on the conspiracy left, or the people who become famous in allegedly exposing them, like whoever that woman was who wrote the book about Holocaust denial. I'm not. Her name isn't coming to me right now. As far as the Chomsky business, and I'll just sort of wrap up with these comments. I think it was important that Chomsky published an article in the Nation, and was widely disseminated, of course, and discussed on Mondoweiss and other places, regarding his views of BDS and one state, two states, and the possibilities that Israel, there's a third option. The option that we see in force right now is that Israel will simply acquire as much land as it can, dominate the Palestinians that are on the remaining land, and that there will be no other option for the Palestinians, as long as the United States supports what Israel does. And he took a lot of criticism for that. And that's the focus that I think, have always had on, in terms of speaking out, in terms of what needs to be said, in terms of anti-Semitism, or what you call, Carl, what you like to call a higher racism, in terms of those people who support the Palestinian movement, but do it in a way that apportions too much power to the Israel lobby and lets the United States off the hook in a way, or asserts, as Mearsheimer Walt did in the Israel lobby 2006. We've been through this drill many times, but maybe some of you are tuning in for the first time, that somehow that the policies that the United States supports in Israel are somehow not in the general interest of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, in terms of control of oil and energy resources and so forth. So again, we have these recurring nightmares of denialism on both a trivial and large scale, of anti-Semitism on both a a very nasty but relatively harmless scale versus a kind of more complicated scale. And then we have the reality on the ground in the Middle East right now, in which Israel will do what it likes. And on the one hand, the Palestinians can't resist that, but with each succeeding series of events, I think some people will argue, and I would certainly, I think I would agree with them, that the PR, the media coverage, and the global image of Israel when it pursues these conflicts, these assaults as it does now, Israel's standing in the world and the manner in which its case is made becomes weaker and weaker, and the global consciousness of the oppression of the Palestinians gets stronger and stronger, albeit that that the Mondoweiss crowd is always looking for a kind of a game changer and thinking that this is going to be the time in which we wake up. But we will not be waking up until we can get our elected officials in Washington and our own national political consciousness to the point where the United States is no longer pursuing the kind of policies in the Middle East that it is.
Thank you, David. Response, Ron?
Don't many of the people, well, some of them anyway, that you're calling Holocaust deniers insist that they're really revisionists and not deniers, that there was such a thing, reasonably called that, but it was just not what is ordinarily presented to us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, revisionism, historical revisionism, is sort of the official name of the Holocaust denier group. I think it's called the Institute for Historical Revisionism. I mean, it's a good propaganda term. I mean, revisionism. I mean, they're trying to give a good word to. They're trying to appropriate the kind of liberal revisionist term from the 1960s and 70s and imply it in a way that does that. But of course, it's just kind of it's just kind of the woman's name was trying to think of, Deborah Lipstadt.
Oh yes,
who became a court of a holy figure in the anti-Semitism group and the whole Holocaust studies group for not very terribly difficult or distinguished work in allegedly exposing this handful of characters, a couple of dozen, few dozen people, Arthur Butts and a few other characters, and David Irving, who don't really do a whole lot of any more harm than the person in this community who's kind of writing and submitting emails to the peace listserv is doing to anything around here. So. I guess what I resent is being told somehow that I must conform, I must denounce this sort of thing. And that's very similar to, in reading The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2, which talks about Cambodia in the killing fields and so forth. The propaganda ploy at that time was that the left would have to, not only was the left keeping these things from being exposed, even though they were being exposed, and other things were being denied at the same time, but that the left somehow has to denounce these things as if the left had caused these things. I mean, there's a whole complicated strategic thing that goes on with propaganda of this nature that seems to recur over and over, where the left is put on the defensive, and therefore we put ourselves in a position of weakness if we don't consistently focus on what the manufacture of consent actually is, who has the power, and what are the powerful people denying, and how are they doing that.
There's a lot here that moves perhaps not from the sublime to the ridiculous, but from the horrendous to the ridiculous. And the area in which this is being contested that David is talking about is particularly a local listserv run by the group AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, an anti-war group that's been around since the 9/11 attacks. They have a discussion list, an email listserv, sort of old-fashioned in a way. A lot of this stuff is turning up on Facebook and places like that these days. But the old-fashioned listserv has been for a dozen years a place for sort of general political discussion, centering on American foreign policy and specifically the constant killing being carried on as part of American foreign policy. That's what the list has been about. And it's wandered off into a variety of other things. I think it's actually worthwhile in that when you survey the current scene locally as well as much beyond the local situation, there aren't many places where real interactive political discussion takes place. It used to, I mean a decade or more ago, occur on some radio talk shows. It did on in the internet in its early days. A lot of these things settled down to communities of agreement. That is, the people on the talk show are listened to by people who agree with them, not by people who disagree with them. The people on the websites are people who hold a set of common ideas, from Holocaust denial to the viciousness of American foreign policy or what have you. In fact, I've thought recently that on the local scene, one of the few places that actual political differences are aired, people with different views contribute, substantially different views on politics, is the letters column of the News Gazette. Mm-hmm. Now, David, as the leading unpaid columnist for the News Gazette, has been one of the occasions for that because frequently there are people writing in to support or attack things that he's written there and things that the rest of us have written too. But there is an exchange going on there, and I'm very happy to see it, and I don't know how we produce more political exchange in the public square these days, but it's a consummation devoutly to be wished.
Let me ask David, what do you think of the offer of the USA to be the mediator negotiating a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel and Gaza?
Well, I mean, it's hard for them to do that when they're supporting Israel's assault.
Yes,
exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It's hard for the Palestinians
completely
to take
laughable
them seriously. I guess it's laughable. I mean, it's not inconceivable that could be done, but I mean, there will be I suppose there will be a process by which this thing winds down. We probably will never quite know what that process is or who's twisting whose arm or what's going on in the back channels, but. I mean, we've come far in some ways and not at all far in other ways in terms of the manner in which the United States continues to sort of facilitate the right-wing Israeli government doing these things and not being able to, there just simply is there's no basis on which the United States diplomacy can act as an honest broker or an even-handed broker, as book after book comes out showing how that's never been the case.
And this Zelikow article that you mentioned, the op-ed in the Times, where he says, well, the U.S. has just got to let the Middle East work out its own problems and we should go away from it. Yeah. I mean, if, as you say, this was a fairy tale, this is, but I mean, he certainly didn't propose the U.S. stop paying for what's going on in the Middle East, or the U.S. stop providing diplomatic cover for what the reason the UN doesn't condemn Israel's actions in the Security Council is, of course, the United States would veto it, as it has time and again whenever the question comes up. Mm-hmm. So there's a disingenuousness to, at the very least, to the suggestion the U.S. Could either walk away or act as an honest broker in what's going on in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're the whole reason that Israel is able to do what it's doing because of the diplomatic, financial, military, and political support that the U.S. provides for Israel. Absent that, international pressure probably would have produced not only a ceasefire in the current dispute, but a more nearly just solution for the Palestinians.
Yeah. In reference to your concern about how these things are discussed locally, I think a kind of graphic example was the Fourth of July local parade that Ron and I both marched in last Friday. It was organized by the PDA, by the Progressive Democrats, and thanks to them for organizing that.
The one group marching, the whole thing,
Yeah,
the parade is organized by News Gazette,
by
right?
the News
Yeah,
Gazette.
right.
The PDA organized a progressive contingent consisting of them and happened to be joined by my former opponent for Congress, George Gollin, and then there was an aware contingent, which were the only. There was this GEO group, I think. There may have been a local environmental group, Sierra Club,
I think, yeah.
and then there was bringing up the rear was the Aware group holding anti-war signs, and I had a sign that was about whistleblowers and supporting Edward Snowden and so forth. But I think that kind of concretely demonstrates the lack of communication within the progressive groups, within the groups that call themselves progressive in this community, regarding foreign policy, regarding these really difficult but what I consider fundamental issues of foreign policy that somehow among people who call themselves progressive, the whole foreign policy business, the war business, our presence in the Middle East, that's a little messy to get involved in if we're going to really make some progress on the environmental front, on the healthcare front, on the women's rights front, on the gay rights front. You sort of have to leave the foreign policy out. And I came up with that. I mean, I came up again very concretely against that, against my campaign where I wanted to talk about foreign policy, but my opponents didn't. And it's kind of hard to have a conversation with yourself. And if regarding these things, so I mean, these things are very obvious and very clear how liberal to left politics works in this country, how party politics works, how electoral politics works, how campaigns work, and how the discourse works and what shapes the discourse in local media like the News Gazette. And I think it's particularly telling how few faculty members bother to state an opinion in the newspaper. I've never really understood whether it's because I understand that, like, I wrote a letter criticizing Phyllis Wise for this kind of ridiculous column that she wrote about the GI Bill. I can understand that a faculty member in good standing, which I am not, would not want to write a letter like what I wrote. But still, it wasn't personal, it wasn't mean, it was just substantive. And there is something about it's more than just, I mean, I really think there is an academic consent. There is the manufacture of consent. I really think that a lot of people, a lot of really intelligent, well-educated, distinguished people don't really get what we're doing in the Middle East. What we're doing in the rest of the world. I think that I have a feeling that 3/4 of the faculty members on this campus could read Zeliko's column and not fall laughing on the floor or crying or whatever their reaction might be. I think they would take it as a serious statement. It probably wouldn't be in the New York Times that way if it couldn't be taken seriously by 75 or 80 or 90% of perfectly respectable academia around this country.
They're busy waiting for Hillary, right?
They are.
Yeah.
And
you're watching News from Neptune on the 11th of July. We are going to shift gears a bit here and go to a series of comments from Ron Zook.
Yes, I want to continue with the same situation to some extent. The current Israel-Palestine war, or Israel-Hamas war, if you prefer, or whatever it is, against Gaza. The score currently is Israel 100 plus killed, Gaza or Hamas or the Palestinians 0. And certain
That's not casualties. That's killings.
that's
Yeah,
right,
right,
deaths.
yeah.
This is apparently counting the corpses.
Yes.
And the complaint seems to be that Israel is suffering horribly from the hundreds of these little ballistic rockets that are being launched into the state of Israel from Gaza. The way the line has changed on this is really amazing to me. A few years ago, when the Palestinians were shooting rockets from Gaza into Israel, these were dismissed as mere pinpricks, insignificant. And this was the official Israeli line, apparently, that they were not really doing any damage and harming almost no one. Suddenly that changed, and it became a huge issue of how can Israel or any country allow this to go on. So now we're starting to get the line from some quarters that we must bring about the final solution to the Hamas problem and the rockets.
You choose your words.
Yeah. He knows what he's doing, I think. Yeah.
So what do you think of that? I'm still interested in David's views on this. Is such a thing possible, feasible, desirable to implement at this time a final solution to the rockets from Gaza problem?
Well, you can connect this with the piece that Chomsky wrote that David referred to earlier, where he points out that what the goal, the solution that Israel is working for is the exclusion, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. They want the land, they don't want the people. And so the point is to drive the people away. And it's an important point. Chomsky says that one of the reasons to think about some questions about the BDS movement is that it's defended by drawing a parallel between South Africa and Israel as apartheid societies. And the suggestion is that what worked with South Africa, you might put a question by how much it worked, but still, what worked with South Africa would work also with Israel. And Chomsky points out that among other differences, apartheid in South Africa depended upon the labor of the black population, and therefore it had to be regulated in ways that served the interests of the white population, and that was the nature of South African apartheid. The same situation does not obtain in Israel and Palestine, that there indeed Israel does not depend upon Palestinian labor. In fact, the Palestinians are a drain on the economy, very slightly, because of course the South Africans supported the Bantustans. Israel does not support the West Bank, and the idea is to drive out the population, a very different position from the ones that South Africa had. Okay, it suggests that similar political methods, however effective they were or weren't in South Africa, might not be in Israel and Palestine.
A few minutes ago, David, I took you to be lamenting the lack of what sometimes called public intellectuals in this country. There was once an official statement or something in an official statement from the university about where are our public intellectuals, and I think you've begun to outline why they are not welcome here, but it would be a danger to their careers if they say something irresponsible. So the University of Illinois seems to have a notable preference for what William Blake called the horses of instruction rather than the tigers of wrath. And I think the university is full of enough careerists to be extremely prudent on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase public intellectual has a couple of meanings, sort of a positive. It has a kind of jaundiced meaning on the Chomskyan left of official, the people that do get to write in the New York Times. But I think a broader, the book on this by an academic named Russell Jacoby, I think outlines pretty well, what the ins and outs of having this class of people is in terms of whether they do operate in a way that opposes power. I think that Chomsky usually uses in a way to refer to a group of people that represent power than question it. But still, I think there is a need. I mean, there's a hunger that I've felt my whole life since I could remember having, thinking about these things, about having just a space in society in which people can engage in genuinely liberal discourse about all these issues, and that's the space that Chomsky provides us. That's the space that he demarcates, and there's many aspects to that, and it just doesn't. There isn't the space on this campus to within certain academic pretenses to discuss these issues. There's something in the program for Jewish culture and society on campus called a program or Center for Holocaust and Genocide Memory. And that could be a very wide-ranging discussion of all of the things that we've been talking about today, but it's not. It's very narrowly construed in academic sense. It concerns the Holocaust and things, and it falls into the problem of making the Holocaust a unique phenomenon in a way that it is unique, but it's not unique. And so it kind of, instead of serving to provoke debate that would be relevant to the kind of things we talk about on this program, I've never noticed that they had any event that I would want to attend for general interest.
So they're not into saying things that might be considered irresponsible?
Yeah, I mean, in other words, to discuss what I'm getting at when I'm talking about part of this is just goes back again for people who maybe haven't watched this program. I mean, it gets back to Norman Finkelstein's critiques of the Holocaust industry, book that came out in 2000 and that has certainly been proven correct. What he said in that book, I think, has been borne out since then, and the manner in which the Holocaust is exploited in various ways.
And it cost him his job.
Yeah, eventually, yeah.
Yeah, well, there may be a few public intellectuals left in Israel. Recently cited one is Gideon Levy on what he calls Israeli rejectionism. Mm-hmm. The settlements, continuing building of the settlements, he claims, show that Israel does not want peace. Not really. They would, of course, say that they do. But
they want peace on their terms.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody wants peace.
Yeah, everybody wants peace.
A piece of this, a piece of that.
Right.
Yeah, but we make the distinction between being pro-peace and anti-war. Everybody's pro-peace, but on their own terms, the question is: are we anti-war, anti-conflict, or pro-justice, or pro-peace with justice? I guess just to briefly harken back to what you were saying before, Ron, I mean, it isn't clear that everything that the Israel government is doing in this assault on Gaza would find favor with the State Department. I mean, I don't think Jen Psaki really appreciates being badgered and hectored at the State Department briefings about whether or not the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. I think that she's really getting pretty tired of that. But there is an Israeli politics involved here. There's a right wing. They have their elections there. Netanyahu has his power there. He has to defend himself from the right much more than from the left, so he has to veer to the right. That all of these tactics, it isn't that I don't think that John Kerry would propose that Israel assault Gaza. He isn't ready to oppose it yet, but it is partly or even mostly about Israeli politics, and the U.S. government and the U.S. foreign policy isn't ready to stand up to that.
Yeah. The U.S. supports Israel because it's our stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East. Now, we'd be just as happy if Israel would find a way to moderate or even solve the, quote, Palestinian problem, close quote. They'd be perfectly happy in Foggy Bottom if that happened, because, in fact, all the U.S. wants out of Israel is its support for U.S. imperial concerns in the Middle East, most notably the control of Middle East energy resources. And the troubles that Israel has, as it were, in its own backyard, as they say, just makes that in some sense more difficult. More difficult from the point of view of the U.S., which wants Israel as its cop on the beat, as the U.S. said when it took Israel on as its chief client after the '67 war. So I mean the current assault on Gaza, yes, the U.S. would be happy to see that go away because, in fact, it gets in the way of Israel being that sort of cop on the beat. I must admit that when I read the justifications that we were getting from for the Israeli attack on Gaza that were being seconded by the State Department. And curiously, as you pointed out, David, even on Democracy Now! This morning, I was reminded of the German government's announcement when it invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Germany announced, as the Blitzkrieg moved into Poland, Germany announced, "We're finally shooting back." The idea being, and what that was the explicit elaboration of what was going on from the German government, that attacks by Polish terrorists on Germans made it necessary for the German army to stop the threats that German citizens were receiving from Polish terrorists. I mean, exactly what you sketched a moment ago, Ron, about the justification that's being accepted by the U.S. for what the Israelis are doing in Gaza right now.
Is it true that Israel has no incentive to get along with its neighbors? If they retaliate against Israeli aggression, they will bring military action against them by the USA.
Well, yeah, I mean, Israel gets along with its neighbors actually pretty well these days. Is Egypt that's a pretty firm alliance now.
Why is that?
Because they're both clients of the United States, and they both have their ruling class that wants to.
Egypt is being paid off massively, as is Jordan and others.
But that was the Camp David arrangement.
They have been for 35 years now.
Exactly.
So.
And remember, I mean, the two chief clients of the U.S. in the region are Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's an effective alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia that comes from the fact that they are both nursing from the United States, to put no finer point on it. This arrangement is actually revealed more and more these days as the American assault on the Middle East has produced this Sunni-Shia civil war throughout the region, with the Israelis uncomfortably aligned with Sunni Saudi Arabia and the American Benoit Iran, the leader, if you like, of the Shia wing. Now, this is uncomfortable in all sorts of ways, and I must admit I was interested to see about the possibility of an attack on the new caliphate by a joint Iranian-American expeditionary force being bruited about in some places. So it's the alliances. The alliances are important, but if we want to understand American policy, we have to remember Lord Palmerston's remarks that a government has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And those interests for the United States are the interests of the 1%. The Israelis know this, and at least some Israelis know that the fantasies about the Israeli government running the American policy are just that, and that it's not out of the question for the U.S., in fact, to withdraw its support from Israel if American interests should be threatened by it.
Or
It's
you think
happened before.
Is that a feasible strategy to isolate and encircle and quarantine Israel-Palestine?
It's a feasible strategy for whom?
For the USA.
To
As
isolate-
we're proposing to do to Russia and China, which is laughable in itself.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, what I want to say is that I think we have to question. I think is something. This is very Chomskyan kind of comment. What constitutes success and failure in U.S. foreign policy? And this goes all the way back to Chomsky's views on the Vietnam War, that it wasn't a failure, it was a success.
Exactly.
That they did quarantine. They did that. What Chomsky has said in many of his talks recently is he refers to a comment that George Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor in the 1960s, said. He says, after the coup in Indonesia in 1965, that saved Southeast Asia. That the virus was contained. That was the biggest threat to it, and what George Bundy said in retrospect was that we could have withdrawn from Southeast Asia or ended the Vietnam War right then to be successful. But it doesn't mean that just because they continue to pursue it and on into Cambodia and so forth makes it unsuccessful. Southeast Asia does not today present the specter of independent nationalism. Similarly, the same thing happened with Nasser in Egypt, and you can look at the Middle East now, and even though it's taken for granted on the left that somehow we're bungling around in the Middle East and failing, and look at what we've done.
Right.
Now we've got
Right.
ISIS, and we supported the Shia, we supported the Sunni, we supported the Sunni against Assad, but now he's turning against Iraq. Oh, isn't this crazy? How those stupid planners? What did they think we were doing, invading Iraq, and what did they think was going to come of this? Well, it's not clear that what's come of this isn't in U.S. interests. It isn't clear that what has come of this, however much a mess it is, however many lives have been lost, it doesn't matter. What matters is U.S. interests and control over the energy resources. And it's not clear that in that perspective, in the same, analogous to the failure in Southeast Asia, that this has been the same kind of failure or not failure in Iraq or in the Middle East in terms of U.S. foreign policy goals.
That independent, U.S. national interest got to be underlined there. This is the important point. And this does stretch back through Vietnam, back to the emergence of the United States as the only undamaged country after the Second World War. U.S. foreign policy is predicated upon U.S. control of the world economy, and that control of the world economy is not necessarily to the benefit of the vast number of Americans. It is very much to the benefit of what we've come to call the 1% in this country, a tiny American economic elite. American foreign policy since 1945, and of course long before that too, although the story is a little different because of the differences in power, American foreign policy since 1945, through the war in Southeast Asia and through the present war in Southwest Asia, American policy has been a policy of construction of friends and enemies in a way that would serve the American elite economic control of the world. It's set out in so many words by George Kennan in the famous policy statement from 1949. George Kennan was the head of the policy planning policy planning section of the State Department. And the U.S. policy is quite consistent in that regard, and as David suggests, on the whole, quite successful. It's only when we understand sort of what the U.S. is trying to do that we begin to analyze the actual actions, which usually means who they're killing, that the U.S. government is undertaking. There was a good piece on the excellent website antiwar.com this week with the line, "Playing with fire, both Israel and Ukraine say no truce for you." And it points out that who's playing with fire here is in fact the United States as well. The empire is in a particularly testy and truculent mood. It's referring to American policy across the world. Two of its appendages have virtually simultaneously eschewed ceasefires in their respective campaigns of aggression. Both have bombarded civilian centers with airstrikes, and Ukraine has been rolling in armored vehicles, while Israel is preparing to do the same. Now, the parallels between Ukraine and Israel make sense only because they represent American policy in both regions. And the fact that the United States, for all Mr. Zelikow wants to go away, and Ron is wondering whether there's an attempt to put a cordon sanitaire around these things. The policy of the United States in both places is to avoid the ceasefires because their thugs are winning. And that's where the Obama administration is right now. We don't mind how many people are killed by that because, in fact, American policy is doing quite nicely, thank you.
Is it in the American national interest to apply pressure to Israel along the lines of BDS?
Is it in American national interest to apply pressure?
You keep saying that that's the key to everything. But is this something that this country should encourage in order to apply pressure to Israel?
Well, it's interesting in a way in that the U.S. government is always willing to use pressure against Israel, which is obvious and quite useful when it wants to. I mean, for example, during the Clinton administration, Israel got into the business of transferring military technology that it received from the United States to the Chinese. Why? Because the Chinese were paying well for it in those days. The U.S. put a stop to that very fast and simply said, you can't do that. I mean, you go back further for examples of this. The great example, of course, is 1956, where Israel, France, and England seized the Suez Canal. And President Eisenhower picked up the phone and said, you guys go home. And they did. So, the notion that the U.S. won't use the power it has over Israeli economy and society is, I think, false.
It's never stopped the settlements. They keep expanding.
But does the U.S. care about the settlements? Yeah. I mean, in fact, it did once during the first Bush administration. The first Bush administration put a stop to one expansion of the settlements precisely because they thought it was diplomatically unwise in American relationship to the Arab states. But now, who cares? From the United States point of view, where's the United States' interest in stopping the settlements?
I think it's really important. BDS isn't a very self-reflective and self-critical movement. I support aspects of it, and I agree with Chomsky's criticisms of it. It's not very self-reflective in a lot of important ways, including the fact that they don't want an outcome like what happened in South Africa. They don't want a neoliberal Israel-Palestine, which is what happened in South Africa. It isn't that, they want to end apartheid, yes, you want to define it properly and end it, but not in a way that still denies the Palestinians their rights, the way that South African blacks are still denied their rights in pretty fundamental ways. So the goal of the BDS movement isn't to get the U.S. government to support the BDS movement in a way that ends Israeli apartheid in a way that keeps the same people in power. If it's consistent, if ending BDS or ending apartheid or promoting BDS becomes consistent with what U.S. elites call their interests in the region, then there's something wrong with BDS. BDS has to, if it's going to be a justice movement, it has to challenge the status quo, and it gets a little more complicated than that. And so, I think that what people like Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein end up sounding relatively sort of conservative or moderate in their approaches towards this. But what they're saying is a two-state solution is much more likely, which is really hammered out in terms of Palestinian sovereignty over the West Bank and Gaza and control of their resources, is much more desirable, not only than a one-state solution in which the Palestinians might be still not share in equal power, but a kind of one state solution in which you simply have Palestinian Bantustans.
It's important to know. You make a very important point there, David, about the fact that the ending of apartheid in South Africa led to a neoliberal state, or simply remove the racist aspects of what was already a neoliberal state and becoming more so. Now that's vital, because any movement that wants to criticize the position of Palestinians, wants to criticize the position of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians, can't be a movement that simply wants to reproduce that. Neoliberalism is primarily an economic program, and hey, that's what we're against.
Yeah. So.
Okay, how much time do we have left?
A couple minutes.
Okay, just quick reminder of what BDS is. I'm not sure everyone knows. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. In 2005, this handout says, Palestinian civil society organizations issued a historic rights-based call to the international community for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, targeting Israel and institutions complicit in its oppressive policies toward the Palestinians until it complies with international law and ensures freedom into occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, equality, full rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and justice, right of return for Palestinian refugees to their homes and lands. And we keep hearing that that will never be, absolutely never be granted.
And what Chomsky upset so many people on Mondoweiss and in other places by saying that it's really not BDS, it's BD. Because sanctions don't mean anything. There's no government there's no government sanctioning Israel in the world, and there isn't any movement among government leaders in this country or anywhere else to sanction Israel in a way that really is gaining any political force.
And most importantly, no possibility of that within the American foreign policy for reasons that we were just discussing. The U.S. says you guys do what you want so long as you continue to support our imperial designs in the region.
Well, there are portions of Europe that are getting restive, I think, on this point. But
right.
That's true.
And I don't want to leave on a negative note. I mean the
the
BD movement. Yeah, right. Be consistent with the rest of the program. But the BD, I mean, I emphasize the consciousness-raising aspects of the what really is the BD movement, and people are, it is good that the various mainline Protestant churches are divesting in various ways. These are symbolic acts. These are acts that can't really hurt Israel. I can't see that any of the so-called successes, whether it's in relation to SodaStream or whatever. Scarlett Johansson is really, gonna hurt Israel, but it's part of a movement in which consciousness raising is a part of it. But that's the relatively easy stuff. The hard stuff is really the political strategy, the political organizing that can put pressure on powerful governments, and in this case, our own government.
We're coming to the end here, and there are two questions that I feel are substantial loose ends, and if you think so too, tune in next week and we'll take them up. One is the question of universities. Any outside observer would say that universities, faculty and students, and others as well, seem to have played very different roles in regard to the Southeast Asian wars of 40 years ago and the Southwest Asian wars of today. Why should that be the case? Are the wars different, or are the universities different? And the answer is yes. The second loose end is the end about David's point about independent nationalism. The crucial point about Indonesia and the vast murder campaign that the CIA organized in Indonesia in 1965, which George Bundy saw as the real key to American policy in the region, the enemy there was not communism, which was the way it was always talked about in this country, but, as David was saying, independent nationalism. And to understand the American fear of independent nationalism, the American government fear of independent nationalism as a motive for American policy over generations is here, I think, the beginning of wisdom. And we will talk about that some in days to come.
I thought love was the beginning of wisdom.
Really? Well... We'll have to talk about that too, I guess.
Okay.
You've been watching news from Neptune for the 28th week of 2014. we're up and over the up to Dover edition. I'm Carl Esterbrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Zoke. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake and Jason. Inshallah, we'll be back next week.
Our new guy, Dan.
Oh, yes, of course. Quite right. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.